माननीय सदस्यगण, जिन्हें आज नियम 377 के अधीन मामले उठाने की अनुमति दी गई है, वे व्यक्तिगत रूप से तत्काल मामले का अनुमोदित पाठ सभा पटल पर प्रस्तुत करें। आइटम नंबर 19, केंद्रीय बजट पर सामान्य चर्चा। डॉक्टर शशि तरूर जी।
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. May I have your permission to speak seated? I am afraid I have a fracture on my foot.
You are permitted, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for granting me the honor of voicing on behalf of the Indian National Congress my perspective on the Union budget presented by the Honourable Finance Minister, whom I'm glad to see in the chamber. Last year, when I was standing in this very place, I had remarked that the 2025 Finance Bill reminded me of the garage mechanic who said, "I couldn't fix your brake, so I made the horn louder." Looking at the budget this year, I'm saddened to observe that though the horn has been muted, that there hasn't been enough movement. For this budget too appears to be a squandered opportunity, equivalent to rearranging the airbags on a crashing car while assuring the passengers that the chassis is sturdy and they will feel better afterwards. This budget is praised for prudence, but prudence without vision or fairness is hollow. It ignores unemployment, it ignores rising living costs, and it ignores inequality, offering little to address the real struggles and aspirations of the Aam Aadmi. The government speaks endlessly of welfare, but its spending tells a very different story. Behind flashy announcements lie chronic underutilization and administrative failure. Media reports show that of over 5 lakh crore budgeted for 53 major welfare and infrastructure schemes last year, barely 41% was spent in the first 9 months of the fiscal year. Take the Jal Jeevan Mission, allotted 67,000 crores, it managed to spend an astonishingly low 31 crores in 9 months. The much-touted PM Schools for Rising India scheme spent only 473 crores out of 7,500. More shocking of all, the Pradhan Mantri Anusuchit Jati Abhyudaya Yojana, meant for the socio-economic upliftment of scheduled castes, utilized out of 2,140 crores, merely 40 crores. This is not governance, Mr. Chairman. This is headline management. Where promises are loud, like that horn, budgets are grand, but delivery is conspicuously absent. The budget this year has landed with a thud, not because of what it contains, but because of what it omits. Behind claims of fiscal prudence lie a more uncomfortable reality. The Indian state is shrinking, not by design, but by compulsion. Government expenditure as a share of GDP has declined over the past decade, briefly rising during the pandemic before reverting close to the 2016 levels, driven by stagnant revenue mobilization. Tax receipts have remained flat relative to GDP. Disinvestment has underperformed, and non-tax revenues increasingly rely on extraordinary transfers such as Reserve Bank of India dividends, an unsustainable substitute for a stable revenue base. More troubling is the shift in the tax burden towards individuals, bearing a greater share of the tax burden than corporations, despite sharp post-pandemic profit growth. To elaborate further, in fiscal year 2017, corporate taxes were 3.2% of GDP, personal income tax was 2.3% of GDP. In fiscal year 27, that is 10 years later, they are projected to be 3.1% for corporates and 3.7% for personal income tax of individuals. So your revenue is coming disproportionately from the individual taxpayers. Fiscal consolidation since COVID has been achieved largely through expenditure compression, presenting necessity as virtue and compulsion as choice. Within these constraints, the government has relied on low-cost measures such as tax simplification and targeted incentives, but the budget offers no credible medium-term framework linking spending to employment and productivity. Capital expenditure is emphasized, yet weak demand, stagnant wages, high youth unemployment, compressed welfare spending, and inadequate devolution to states all persist, leaving India fiscally disciplined but developmentally constrained, without the revenue capacity or strategic clarity to deliver real economic security for the Aam Aadmi. This is why, Mr. Chairman, this is what I call an underwhelming budget. Now, let me look at specific sectors. M.S. Swaminathan had famously said, if agriculture goes wrong, nothing else will have a chance to go right. And this, I believe, is as good a starting point as any. Mr. Chairman, it's high time we stop treating agriculture as some issue that will sort itself out, because 46.1% of India's workforce and 60% of our population depend on agriculture and allied activities. Despite agriculture contributing 16 to 17% of GDP, it receives only 3% of this union budget, 1.62 lakh crore, which is a 5.1% cut from last year's 1.71 lakh crore. Now, this underinvestment is all the more alarming, Mr. Chairman, given the existential threats facing Indian agriculture today. This sector, vital as it is increasingly threatened by climate change and misaligned farming practices. Nearly two-thirds of the country are prone to drought, and the toll of weather-related disasters has been severe. Yet the Fasal Bima Yojana, meant to protect farmers, has failed. Flawed assessments and opaque settlements have reduced compensation to token amounts, 1 rupee, 3 rupees, 21 rupees, as your minister himself has acknowledged, turning protection into systemic injustice. Matters are worsened by cuts that leave the scheme at its lowest budget allocation in 8 years, fueling fears that new initiatives will repeat a familiar cycle of announcement without commitment, as seen last year when Gradley announced missions on cotton technology, pulses, vegetables, fruits, and hybrid seeds, all quietly faded with zero funding in the revised estimates. These announcements are like modern courtships, promises without commitment. That's what this government does to us. At a time when farm distress is deepening, the budget silence on revising the PM Kisan Nidhi disbursement speaks louder than any promise made elsewhere. हमारे किसानों की आय दोगुनी करने का वादा तो आपसे पूरा हो नहीं पाया। कम से कम उनकी सम्मान निधि ही बढ़ा दीजिए। पिछले 6 सालों से ये सिर्फ 6,000 रुपए पर ही अटकी हुई है। While there is an imperative need for breakthroughs in research and development and AI-driven agricultural technologies, paradoxically, funding allocations for agricultural research and education have dipped by 4.8% from the previous year's 10,466 crore, that's now to 9,967 crore, decreasing precisely when the finance minister is announcing new AI schemes. And frankly, Madam, touting a new AI app when the majority of our farmers can't afford fertilizers, harvesters, or tractors seems rather detached from reality, except of the virtual kind. Now, this budget speaks at length about crops from cashews to coconuts, yet ignores one of agriculture's most persistent concerns, pepper. Once hailed as black gold, the sector is now in distress in my state. In Kerala, which is one of the country's leading producers of pepper, output has fallen from 40,000 plus tons to 30,000 tons and is projected to decline by a further 28.7% in the foreseeable future. The uncomfortable truth, Mr. Chairman, is that our spice market faces such deep challenges today that if history repeated itself, the British might not even bother looting us for it. Next to unemployment. This House has had this conversation far too many times. We recite the same statistics, express the same concerns, and then move on, while unemployment quietly worsens. The data at the end of 2025 makes one thing unmistakably clear. Rural unemployment has stagnated at 3.9%, while urban unemployment continues to rise, ending at 6.7% in December. The crisis is now starting to concentrate where aspirations and frustrations are colliding in our cities. And yet even the centre's flagship responses have failed to rise to the moment. Under the Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana, barely 41% of certified candidates secured placements. More than half of those jobs were concentrated in just 5 sectors. And of the 1,380 crores released, 278 crores remained unutilized. The Prime Minister Internship Scheme tells a similar story. Allocation 10,831 crores. Ministry spends 526 crores in the first 9 months. This pattern is recurrent, sir. In fiscal year 25, allocations were cut after large unspent balances, with actual spending at just 680 crores. So much for creating employment when we can't even spend the money allocated for the job of creating employment. And what of gig workers, the backbone of our new economy? There is no mention of them in the budget. Their welfare has been deprioritized at a time when unrest grows over the absence of clearly defined benefits, time-bound claims and appeals mechanisms, and mandatory disclosure of work hours, earnings and deductions. This silence further weakens the gig workers' access to social security in practice. Any discourse about the workers of our country stands incomplete without a discussion about Manrega, now replaced by the ambitious VB-G Act. It increased guaranteed work days from 100 to 125, introduced weekly wage payments, but at the same time it hollowed out the legal employment guarantee. While Manrega was demand-driven, fully centrally funded for unskilled wages, and rooted in decentralized planning, the new Act caps central funding through state-wise normative allocations, shifts 40% of the costs, the wage costs, to most states, and allows the scheme to be paused for up to 60 days during the peak agricultural seasons, shrinking the real window of guaranteed work. Once a state's allocation is exhausted, workers' statutory right to employment effectively ends. This converts an open-ended rights-based program into a budget-restricted, centrally rationed scheme where fiscal ceilings override legal entitlements. The VB-G scheme received a massive allocation of 95,000 crores in this budget, yet it has a major overlooked flaw that also needs to be addressed as soon as possible, Madam Minister. It attempts inclusion, but perhaps unintentionally drives technological exclusion. Manrega trusted the panchayats and gram sabhas to plan work based on local needs and community strengths. But the G Act mandates dashboards with GIS tools, PM Gati Shakti layers, central digital stacks. Local priorities are filtered through a Viksit Bharat national rural infrastructure stack, making biometrics, geotagging, dashboards and AI audits statutory requirements. Thus, for millions of tech workers, for rural workers, one tech failure will mean exclusion without appeal and work without skill considerations. Now, when you have millions struggling to find work, Mr. Chairman, the least the government can do is to ensure that they move freely across the country to seek opportunities. But here too, Mr. Chairman, we see a pattern of neglect that is as consistent as it is shameful. Nowhere, I might add, is this neglect of connectivity clearer than in Kerala. Despite repeated demands for new railway lines to decongest existing routes, the state finds no mention in the Finance Minister's much-touted 7 high-speed railway corridor initiative. One is compelled to ask, does strategic connectivity end where political inconvenience begins? The consequences of this neglect are borne daily by passengers and railway staff alike in my state. Chronic overcrowding has pushed passenger capacity to dangerous limits. Sanitation has visibly deteriorated. Even basic facilities remain inadequate. It's telling, Mr. Chairman, that locomotive pilots entrusted with the safety of thousands are forced to work without assured access to toilets. For passengers, the experience is no better. Overcrowded coaches, unsanitary conditions, and a steady erosion of dignity that no glossy brochure can conceal. These failures are structural, they're not incidental. The railway sanction strength across categories stands at over 2 lakhs, yet only about 1.59 lakh employees are in service. This staffing deficit compromises safety, delays operations, and stretches frontline workers beyond reasonable limits. A railway system cannot run on announcements alone. Continued underinvestment in capacity, personnel, and basic human conditions risks turning the nation's lifeline into a symbol of administrative exhaustion. And it's not just railways, Mr. Chairman. We hear of national corridors and maritime ambitions, but Vilnius Port, India's gateway to global trade, our only port that can host the world's largest container ships, is treated as a local afterthought, with no central support announced for the road and rail connectivity that is hampering its potential as a world-class transshipment port. Similarly, while 20 new national waterways are to be operationalized, it remains unclear how many, if any, will benefit Kerala. Ship repair ecosystems are promised in Patna and Varanasi, but not in a state with 44 rivers and a rich inland waterway network. Our coastal communities, Mr. Chairman, face the deadly peril of sea erosion that has already leached so much of our territory into the sea. But there is no money for the sea walls and groins so essential for coastal protection. I have been raising this repeatedly in the House over the last 15 years. The centre tells me it's a state's problem. The state says it has no money. So we continue losing our territory, our seafront, to the marauding ocean. The lives and livelihoods of our fisher folk, mostly living below the poverty line, are apparently of no concern to our budget makers either. And if maritime connectivity disappoints, Mr. Chairman, should we rely on the air? The regional connectivity